The dust, fine and red as ground brick, stung his eyes even before they'd shoved the sack over his head. Now, in the darkness, it was all he could taste and smell. It filled his lungs with each ragged breath, a gritty testament to the miles they'd dragged him. When they finally ripped the hood away, the sudden assault of the late afternoon sun made him flinch. He blinked, his vision swimming, until the world resolved into a grim circle of faces. He was in the center of a village, a collection of hide lodges nestled in a high desert canyon. Red rock walls soared around them, painted in the long, stretching shadows of the dying day. The air was cool and carried the scent of juniper smoke and roasting meat, a cruel contrast to his predicament. His hands were bound tight behind his back with rawhide, the cords biting deep into his wrists. His name was Elias, and he was a cowboy, a drifter. And he was about to die for a crime he didn't commit. The faces surrounding him were stern, etched with a cold, simmering anger he understood all too well. He'd been found near the body of one of their young hunters, a boy named Little Hawk, his throat slit, his horse and newly taken elk pelts stolen. The evidence was damningly simple: Elias's own hunting knife, left clumsily at the scene, and his tracks leading away. He'd been hunting antelope miles away, but a sudden, freakish dust storm had swept in, erasing his own trail and leaving him disoriented, a perfect pawn for a brutal frame-up. The tribal council, a ring of older men with faces like weathered leather, sat on a semicircle of blankets before him. At their center was the chief, a man named Gray Cloud. His hair was a shock of white against his dark, seamed skin, and his eyes, the color of dark flint, held a weight of grief and authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. He was Little Hawk's grandfather. "You were found with his blood on your shirt." Gray Cloud's voice was low, but it carried through the clearing like a rumble of distant thunder. He gestured to Elias's chest, where a dark, rusty smear stood out against the faded blue cotton. "Your knife was in his back. Your tracks led from his body. You stole what was his. Do you deny this?" Elias met his gaze, his own throat tight with a fear he refused to let surface. "I deny it," he said, his voice rough from thirst and dust. "I found him that way. I pulled the knife out, trying to see if I could help. The blood, it must have gotten on me then. The storm came and wiped my trail clean to this canyon, but it also wiped clean the tracks of the real killer. He's here. Among you." A ripple of disbelief and anger went through the crowd. A tall, broad-shouldered warrior named Bear Who Runs sneered. "He lies to save his own skin. He speaks with a forked tongue, like all the white men." Elias's eyes swept the crowd, desperate. He had one card to play, a single, fragile observation he'd made in those frantic moments by the boy's body. "The man who did this," Elias said, forcing his voice to steadiness. "He rides a horse with a cracked rear hoof on the left side. The print is distinct. And he carries the pelts in a sack made of a grain blanket, the kind your people trade for at the fort. I saw the impression in the dirt before the storm hit." He saw a few eyes flicker with uncertainty. The description was specific. But Gray Cloud's expression did not change. "Many horses have cracked hooves. Many own grain sacks. This proves nothing. You were the one caught with the evidence." The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Elias could see it in the set of their jaws, in the hard light in their eyes. Justice in this land was swift and final. He was an outsider, caught red-handed. The logic was inexorable. Gray Cloud stood, his movements slow and heavy with sorrow. The crowd fell utterly silent. This was the moment. "For the life of my grandson, Little Hawk," the chief began, his voice resonating with a final, terrible power, "there must be a payment. The spirits demand balance. This man, this stranger, has been judged by the evidence. His life." "Father, wait." The voice was clear and firm, cutting through the heavy pronouncement like a knife. The crowd parted, and a young woman stepped into the circle. She was Gray Cloud's daughter, Falling Leaf. Elias had noticed her earlier, standing slightly apart, her intense, dark eyes studying him not with hatred, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity. She was known for her quiet wisdom and her uncanny connection to the world beyond the visible, a trait both respected and slightly feared. Gray Cloud paused, a flicker of impatience in his gaze. "Daughter, this is not your place." "It is my place if I hold a truth you do not," she replied, her gaze not on her father, but locked on Elias. She walked toward him, her deerskin dress whispering against the dry earth. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, the set of his shoulders, the honest desperation in his own eyes. The tension was a physical thing, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Bear Who Runs took a half-step forward. "Falling Leaf, do not listen to his poison." She ignored him. She looked from Elias, bound and helpless, to the faces of her people, and then, finally, to her father. Her chest rose and fell with a deep breath. The entire tribe, the very canyon itself, seemed to be holding its breath with her. Then, she spoke. Just 4 words. 4 words that dropped into the silence not like stones, but like dynamite. A collective gasp, then a roar of anger surged from the crowd. The web of lies, so carefully constructed, had not just been shattered, it had been incinerated by the truth. Bear Who Runs had murdered one of their own, a young man who looked up to him, to steal a few pelts and frame a passing cowboy, consolidating his own position by appearing to bring the killer to justice. Gray Cloud looked from the pelts to the face of his trusted warrior, and the grief in his eyes was now mingled with a bottomless shame. He gave another, quieter command. Bear Who Runs, his defiance crumbling into a wretched, snarling fear, was seized by a dozen hands. The sounds of his struggles were quickly swallowed by the angry muttering of the tribe. Gray Cloud then turned to Elias. He walked forward, and with his own bone-handled knife, he sliced through the rawhide bonds on Elias's wrists. The blood rushed back into his hands with a painful, prickling fire. "I have failed the spirits," Gray Cloud said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw only what was placed before my eyes. I did not look into the shadows beside it. You came to us as a stranger, and we offered you only death. For this, I beg your forgiveness." Elias rubbed his raw wrists, his body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline and relief. He looked at Falling Leaf, who stood watching him, her expression now one of quiet sorrow for the darkness that had been revealed in her own home. She had not just saved his life, she had saved the soul of her tribe from a terrible, enduring injustice. "There is nothing to forgive," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "You sought justice for your blood. I would have done the same." He was offered food, shelter, a place to stay for as long as he wished. But as the night deepened and the village wrestled with its new, painful truth, Elias knew he had to go. This was their pain to heal, their wound to bind. As he rode out of the canyon at first light on a horse they had given him to replace his own stolen mount, a single figure stood at the village's edge. It was Falling Leaf. She lifted a hand in a silent farewell. He nodded in return, a gesture of profound gratitude that words could never capture. The vast frontier sky above him was clear and endless. He was a lone cowboy again, riding into the wilderness. But he was no longer just a drifter. He carried with him the searing memory of how close he had come to death, and the stunning power of a single, courageous truth, spoken by the most unexpected voice, that had shattered a lie and rebuilt the world upon a foundation of honor. Justice, he now knew, wasn't always obvious. Sometimes, it was a quiet whisper waiting for the courage to be heard. "The pelts are here." For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No comprehension. Then, the meaning detonated. The real killer hadn't had time to flee or to hide his spoils. He was here, in the village, the stolen goods hidden among his own possessions, waiting for the heat of the investigation to cool after the convenient outsider was executed. Chaos erupted. Voices rose in confusion and denial. Gray Cloud's eyes widened, the grief in them momentarily eclipsed by a dawning, horrific realization. His daughter would not say such a thing lightly. Her visions, her intuitions, they were rarely wrong. Falling Leaf turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the men in the council, the warriors standing guard. Her eyes lingered for a moment on Bear Who Runs. He was the one who had been most vocal, most insistent on Elias's immediate execution. He was a man of respect, a provider, a fierce defender of the tribe. "A cracked hoof," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I saw Bear Who Runs tending to his sorrel mare's left rear hoof this morning." "A stone bruise," he said. All eyes swung to Bear Who Runs. His confident sneer had vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned fury. "She lies. The white man has bewitched her." "And a grain sack," Falling Leaf continued, relentless. She pointed toward his lodge, one of the largest in the village. "The one he brought back from the fort trading post last moon. The one with the blue stripe. It is not with his supplies." "Where is it, Bear Who Runs?" The accusation hung in the air, undeniable. The specific details Elias had provided, now given form and name within their own community, were undeniable. Gray Cloud's face was a storm. He gave a sharp, guttural command. Two younger warriors, their own faces a mixture of shock and determination, moved toward Bear Who Runs' lodge. The big warrior moved to block them, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "You would take the word of this witch and a stranger over mine?" he roared. That single, hostile movement was his undoing. It was an admission of guilt more powerful than any words. The tribesmen who had stood beside him moments before now looked at him with dawning horror and betrayal. The two young warriors pushed past him and disappeared into his lodge. The silence that followed was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of a world breaking. When the warriors emerged, one of them carried a bundled-up sack made of coarse, traded cloth with a faded blue stripe. It was bulging. He untied the top and dumped the contents onto the ground. The rich, dark pelts of a freshly killed elk tumbled out, gleaming in the firelight.